Salim, there's a lot of angles to the SNC-Lavalin scandal that haven't been fleshed out as much as they should be in the mainstream media. Can you give us some of the backstory which led up to the scandal?
Yes, there are many different angles on this issue, and we need to have a clear understanding of the backstory that led up to the Director of the Public Prosecution Services, Kathleen Roussel, very likely to deny the effort on the part of SNC-Lavalin and the PMO, the Prime Minister, his Principal Secretary, Gerald Butts, the Clerk of the Privy Council, Michael Wernick, the Finance Minister, Bill Morneau, and his Chief of Staff, Ben Shin, and all of these people who piled up on the former Attorney General and Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould to influence her and direct her, leverage her to get Kathleen Roussel to drop the charges that the PPA, the Public Prosecution Services, was going to proceed with against SNC-Lavalin, and to give them the DPA, which is the Deferred Prosecution or Remediation Agreement. And I think the backstory is very important, and so let's talk about it. But before I get into the backstory, let me emphasize right at the outset what the big issue about SNC-Lavalin is, because many of the public commentators in the media, the mainstream media, have come out to sort of dismiss it, and they say, why was there is no scandal in this? Why wasn't Attorney General, the former Attorney General, willing to give SNC-Lavalin the DPA when it is in our criminal code now, when it is in our statute, when it was one of the remedy, or in fact the remedy that the Prime Minister was and his people were lobbying for, or trying to influence Jody Wilson-Raybould to do in directing her director not to prosecute SNC-Lavalin. Why not give them the DPA? The Prime Minister went on, when the story broke 2 months ago and counting. That's on February 7th, when Robert Fife of the Globe and Mail broke the story, that there have been pressures brought upon the former Attorney General, which led to first her demotion from that office in January, from being the Attorney General and Justice Minister to become demoted to being the Veteran Affairs Minister, and then the subsequent resignation that followed. So in this 2 months, a lot has happened, Robert. You know, if you want to list it, there has been several resignations, starting with that of Jody Wilson-Raybould, then Gerald Butts, the Principal Secretary, then Jane Philpott, the President of the Treasury Board, and Michael Wernick, the Clerk of the Privy Council, which then was followed by what was the headline news a week ago, or less than a week ago, the Saturday Night Massacre.
I'm having like thoughts of like the Saturday Night Massacre here.
Or was it the Tuesday Night Massacre? This Tuesday Night Massacre, because it happened last Tuesday, of the expulsion of both Jody Wilson-Raybould and Jane Philpott from the Liberal Parliamentary Caucus. So there's a lot that has happened, and I think more will happen. One has been the letter that the lawyer for the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, Julian Porter, wrote to the Leader of the Opposition, Andrew Scheer, which Andrew Scheer then revealed only this past Sunday, that the letter has, in a sense, threatened Mr. Scheer that he might be brought to court for libelous statement. This is where we are right now. The backstory is, number one, we need to understand why is SNC-Lavalin being prosecuted. This is one of the largest engineering company in Canada, based in Montreal. That leads us to understanding that Canada is a signatory to the convention of the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, and Canada is a signatory to the convention of corruption of foreign public officials, that would be a crime, which prohibits any of our major companies or companies in doing business abroad to be engaged in any ways with corrupting and giving bribes to foreign officials to secure business. SNC-Lavalin has been indicted and found guilty by the World Bank and other United Nations agencies on precisely engaging in such activity that led the World Bank to prohibit SNC-Lavalin from participating in any project which is a World Bank finance project. This story leads us to SNC-Lavalin's engagement in Libya. The Libyan government reached out to the Canadians in the area of its own infrastructural development. Paul Martin's visit to Libya in 2004 opened that possibility, and SNC-Lavalin is one of the largest engineering firms in the world, won contracts in Libya for infrastructural development. But then there was the Arab uprising, and that Arab uprising affected in 2011 in North Africa and parts of Middle East, and that affected the Muammar Gaddafi regime because there was an uprising in Libya that turned into a civil war. It became very ugly. The opposition forces to Gaddafi succeeded in overthrowing Gaddafi's regime. Gaddafi was captured and he was murdered. He was killed. Well, one of the things that happened as a result of all of this taking place in Libya in 2011, 2012, was that the new people who took power in Benghazi got all the papers, files, documents of the Libyan regime, and they started digging into it and handing over to the United Nations these documents that implicated or that were evidence of the nature of the brutal regime of Muammar Gaddafi, that his government had committed crimes against humanity. So these papers now the UN had, and the United Nations then started handing over these papers to the respective governments who were involved in whatever activities, business, trade, diplomacy, commerce, and in the case of Canada, SNC-Lavalin, in infrastructural support, development, construction in Libya. And those are the papers that ended up in the hands of our government, went into the Attorney General and Justice Ministry to be investigated. And we can go back and draw the dots, draw the connection. All of this happened in 2015. That was also the election year in Canada. Stephen Harper's government was responsible at that time, in the year 2015, as these information came from the United Nations and went into the office of the Public Prosecution Services. But then Stephen Harper lost the election. The Conservative Party lost. The Liberals under Justin Trudeau came to power in October of 2015, and it became their responsibility to carry forward what was now a responsibility on the part of the Canadian government to look into the activities of SNC-Lavalin under those statutes. And we can infer from that what the prosecutors discovered were possibly very grim. We had news information, now we know, that the SNC-Lavalin official responsible for the Libyan business was a Libyan Canadian, is a Libyan Canadian by the name of Riyad Ben Issa. He was arrested by the Swiss government in 2012, I believe, and held by the Swiss government for more than 2 years before he was released to the Canadian government. We in the public do not know what he revealed to the Swiss government as part of his plea bargain to get out and come to Canada, or what was arranged for his transfer to Canada. But we can assume a great deal is in the hands of the prosecutors in the office of the Attorney General. And among the things that we have learned is that the SNC-Lavalin gave something close to $50 million in bribe to the dictator Muammar Gaddafi, his sons and members of his family. There are reports that a yacht was purchased for one of the sons of Muammar Gaddafi, that there were trafficking in procurement of prostitutes, that there were possibly things that Muammar Gaddafi's sons did during this period that would lead them to be indicted for crimes against humanity. And SNC-Lavalin in some ways was involved in bribing these people who were running the government, and SNC-Lavalin officials knew about it. And there are reports that something like $130 million is missing from Libyan accounts that were contracted to SNC-Lavalin that have been not accounted for. And there must be much, much more in the evidence that have been put together by the people in Benghazi, passed on to the UN official, that the Swiss government people knew about, and that have been provided to the Canadian government. So that's the backstory. So now we come to SNC-Lavalin in Canada, and now what we know is the SNC-Lavalin officials were deeply engaged in lobbying effort with the Canadian government, with the PMO, the Prime Minister's office of Justin Trudeau, in the period after 2015, when the Liberals became the government, to see to ways in which the Attorney General and the Director of Public Prosecution Services would drop the conviction against SNC-Lavalin.
And what will happen is it will be deemed political interference from day one, when people were talking about why are we entering into or putting a DPA regime in place. Everybody knows it was because of SNC. Whether that's true or not, that's what people think.
Not prosecute them in court, but find a remedy through some agreement which other countries have of the OECD. United States have it, Britain, France, Germany have it, that is known as deferred prosecution, so that companies charged for corruptions and bribes under those statutes may be given, if they meet certain conditions, certain threshold, may be given a deferred prosecution that may be fined, be given some other punishment, but not be taken to court, so that they then are not prohibited or put under ban from participating in public contracts. So that was the lobbying effort that the SNC-Lavalin was engaged in. There are reports that something like 80 times the officials of the SNC-Lavalin approached the PMO and the Finance Ministry to arrange for such a remedy. We now know that Justin Trudeau's government put through an amendment in our criminal code to provide for DPA. So the criminal code was amended, but it was not amended by a direct standalone bill. It was something that was snuck into the 2018 omnibus budget bill of several hundred pages last year. And once passed, now the government had the statute, and it was the pressure brought upon the former Attorney General to see that she directs the Director of Public Prosecution to use that statute, that amended criminal code, the provisions of DPA, the Deferred Prosecution Act, to give the remedy to not prosecute SNC-Lavalin, to not take them to court. And that is where the former Attorney General declined the pressures brought upon her. She said no to the Prime Minister. She said no to the Clerk of the Privy Council.
I know I have a tool under the Prosecution Act that I can use. I do not believe it is appropriate to use it in this case.
To the Principal Secretary, Gerald Butts, according to her first testimony, something like 20 phone calls and emails and notes were pressed upon her and her Chief of Staff, Jessica Prince, to basically direct Kathleen Roussel, the Director of Public Prosecution Services, not to proceed with the conviction of SNC-Lavalin. When Attorney General declined, when she held firmly, when she indicated to the Prime Minister that when she had been informed by the Director that the office will go forward with the prosecution, she did her due diligence. She then checked out what the papers, what the evidence that the office had gathered, and she decided that yes, they should go forward, and SNC-Lavalin does not, in this instance, deserve the remedy, that is, the remediation agreement. I suspect, given all of what has happened and what I have in some ways related, is that there were victims. Obviously, there have been many victims in Libya of brutality, abuse, even deaths brought about as a result of the behavior of the dictator, Muammar Gaddafi, and his rule. And some of that stains SNC-Lavalin, with SNC-Lavalin's intimate relationship with the Libyan regime of Muammar Gaddafi and his sons. So there are victims of abuse, and I think this is a matter of such serious impact that the indictments for which SNC-Lavalin would be taken to the court are of a nature that it cannot be brushed aside. It's not simply a matter of paying bribes to win a contract. And the fact that the Prime Minister was bearing down upon the Attorney General has now become an international news. The Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development has taken heed of what has happened and have indicated that Canada is a member of this convention and that this would have a very negative consequence. A very negative message would go out to the world that we do not take it seriously what we are committed to by our own acts, by our own statute, and by being a signatory to an international convention on this matter.
But surely SNC-Lavalin has changed with new leadership since these events have happened. Wouldn't it be prudent to give the DPA, considering the fact that these people are no longer in charge of SNC?
For us, that is for the public, it is to understand that this is not about protecting SNC-Lavalin. This is about the rule of law in this country. And so we have to understand that. That is, in our system of government, in our democracy, and this goes all the way back in our history, in our tradition, to the Magna Carta, to the independence of the prosecutors, not to be in any way under the influence or to be influenced by the politicians, by the people in power. There is almost sacrosanct the idea and the principle that the prosecutorial authority is entirely independent of the political leaders. And the political leaders are not to in any way engage in trying to influence and decide what the prosecutors are going to do or should do. What is the symbol of our prosecution? What is the symbol of our justice? It is the lady, the blindfold, holding the scale in her hand. That justice will be done, and the justice will be done fairly and equally, but more important is it's also seen to be done. And that's why the Attorney General stands apart. Though the Attorney General is in the cabinet, but the decision of the Attorney General and the people of the Office of Attorney General is completely insulated from political interference. Well, one of the first acts of the Stephen Harper government was to further insulate the Office of Attorney General by creating within the Office of Attorney General this new office called the Public Prosecution Services. Stephen Harper, in a minority government, was able to put through the Public Prosecution Services Act through the Parliament. A minority government put the act. That means other parties supported it. The stink of the ad scam scandal was so immense that this statute was passed, this office was created. It further insulates the Office of the Attorney General on matters of prosecution from political interference. That is what Justin Trudeau's government was trying to influence. In other words, put his finger on the scale of the lady blindfolded. You're not supposed to interfere. You're not supposed to talk to. You're not supposed to indicate any wishes or desires on matters of prosecution to the Attorney General and her office.
She actually brought up to Michael Wernick that she's thinking about the Saturday Night Massacre, in which, of course, we're talking about Nixon firing his Attorney General. And so she said to Michael Wernick, this is not only inappropriate, basically, she's saying that my job is on the line by what you're doing. So she knew this was a threat.
Michael Wernick indicated that the Prime Minister is pretty upset.
In a mood, I think he
in
said.
the mood, quite angry or quite engaged in a way that he is going to, according to Michael Wernick, he is going to find some way to get this done. That is, he wants SNC-Lavalin not to be prosecuted and a remediation agreement given to them. What does this mean? It means that there is going to be two tiers of law. In our system of government, in our rule of law, that there's two tiers of law. One for the powerful, the privileged,
The liberal donors.
the influence, the liberal. SNC-Lavalin is not only engaged in lobbying the Prime Minister's office, SNC-Lavalin has been a heavy donor to the Liberal Party.
Mind you, most companies in Canada, when they can do it, they give money to all of the major parties, hedging their bets, of course.
That's right. But in the case of SNC-Lavalin, I think it is very large sums of money over a very long period of time to just one party, you know, which is the Liberal Party. I mean, they've given some peanuts to the Conservative Party, but it is, you know, the Liberal Party is the recipient, and now we are calling upon, after having made the contribution. So you can see how these things circulate. SNC-Lavalin has also been charged for bribes and corrupting officials in Canada. The Jacques Cartier Bridge, the McGill Hospital, I believe. So this is nothing new. So they have been buying out public officials through contracts, which then comes from the public purse. That means it comes from the people, Canadians who are taxpayers, and it goes to one particular party. If SNC-Lavalin is convinced that they have cleaned up their act, that they are being, you know, penalized wrongfully, make the case in the court to the justices, and the burden of proof to get a conviction would be upon the Crown Attorney. It is not upon the defendant. In our rule of law, the defendant goes into court under the basis of presumption of innocence. So it is, the burden of proof is on the Crown, and that is the defense. But that's not what the Prime Minister was engaged in, and his people were engaged in. They were engaged in basically corrupting our system of government, our rule of law, which led to all that has happened since, and it seems it's not going away.
This is a constitutional principle of prosecutorial independence that, Michael, I have to say, including this conversation, previous conversations that I've had with the Prime Minister and many other people around it, it's entirely inappropriate, and it is political interference.